Thank you, Krista, for a remarkably intellectually agile piece of work. The fourth speaker this morning is Professor Jacqueline Bussey of Capital University. When she has concluded her remarks, I will invite all of the four speakers to take their places on the podium, and we will have a kind of, I've always wanted to be Oprah Winfrey moment, and we will have microphones available in the hall for you to pose your questions, and they will respond. Jacqueline?
It's really an impressive set of papers, isn't it? Thank you. For those with eyes to see, the 21st century is a newborn's face ravaged by incongruous scars. In the face of Darfur, Enron, 30,000 children a day dead because of starvation and simple infections, 1.2 billion people without access to clean drinking water, 71 tons of topsoil eroding daily, 1 billion people living in abject poverty, and the average U.S. CEO making 369 times the salary of that of their own workers, I ask of you, what is hope? For what should we, global Christians of the 21st century, hope? What is the source of our hope? Is Christian hope confined to eschatology? What are hope's dangers and limits? How can responsible Christians safeguard our hope discourse from obscenity, Pollyannaism, platitudes, and quietism? In the short time I have this morning, I will argue that though we should at points critique and transcend Luther's own thought, ultimately Luther's thought does help us to grapple with our hope questions. In particular, Luther provides an answer to the question of how 21st century Christians with a global perspective can speak, without obscenity or quietism, a word of genuine hope to the radical negativity and human suffering of our time. According to Luther, we need hope because the world is a wilderness, and because God's seeming injustice causes us incomparable spiritual anguish. Like the early Hebrews, Luther explains that we are in possession of the divine promises, but not yet their fulfillment. Our lives are lived in prolepsis, the existential tension we feel between God's just eschaton, what Luther calls the coming summer, and, quote, this present winter, as Luther calls our life on earth, is hope. Hope is, first and foremost for Luther, an eschatological question which will receive a divine answer at the eschaton. As believers in the gospel, hearers of the good news, we hope in the end to receive redemption, resurrection of the body, and life everlasting in God's presence. Writes Luther, for if the resurrection is nothing, and yet I believe in it, what is that but a mere dream with a sequel? If it were true that this article is false and that there is nothing to a life beyond, this would constitute the greatest deception ever perpetrated on earth. Many, including myself, would count Luther's theological honesty about the ostensible prosperity of evil and the poverty of God's justice among his finest strengths. In The Bondage of the Will, however, Luther proposes a disturbing and facile theodicy. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I'll remind you of it. He writes, by the light of nature, it is an insoluble problem how it can be just that a good man should suffer and a bad man prosper. But this problem is solved by the light of grace. This whole insoluble problem of God's injustice finds a quick solution in one short sentence, namely, that there is a life after this life, and whatever has not been punished and rewarded here will be punished and rewarded there, since this life is nothing but an anticipation, or rather, the beginning of the life to come. End quote. For Luther, this solution renders the perennial problem of evil question both, and I'm quoting here, easily settled and put aside. I go on, of course, to critique Luther's snappy theodicy by using other aspects of Luther, as is so often possible to the delight of us Luther theologians and scholars. I would not be the first, of course, to shoot holes in this theodicy of eschatological retribution, this God of the retributive hourglass. These holes bleed quietism and opiates, intoxicating us to accept the status quo. While it is certainly true that Christians do believe in God's redemption and justice in the afterlife, the problem with Luther's quick solution of eschatological postponement is, in my view, that it fails to address neither our nor the psalmist's lament of how long, Lord, how long? The question of human suffering is not just a when question, it is a why question, and even a how could you question. And Luther's short answer only further confounds those honest enough to ask the latter too. Luther, usually unafraid of paradox, uses the not yet here to completely eclipse any already The so-called light of grace seems like it is anything but grace, or if it is such a free gift given in love, it is one many among us would rather return unopened. It is my claim that a 21st century global Christian word of hope needs to take human suffering and radical evil as seriously as it takes redemption in order to be heard. Fortunately, when Luther exegetes the Psalms and lived experience, these texts force him to confront the queer pain of prolepsis, and he responds often beautifully. In Luther's theology of the cross, the resurrection, we know, is no quick solution. It is longing and lament. In this way, Luther speaks to 21st century Christians seeking a mad reconciliation between the gospel and CNN. Concludes Luther, in the midst of a feeling of death, he, and Luther's talking about David, acquired a hope in life. We are taught to hope for life and grace amid death and the wrath of God. This theology must be learned through experience. Luther also notes that though Christ was always filled with hope, quote, nevertheless, he grieved. Following Christ will entail the same for us, not a false either or, but a genuine nevertheless, both and. Writes Luther, rejoice in your hope, because you can surely be sad over the things that are seen and are past, while rejoicing over future and unseen things. Luther helps us to speak in the both and language so desperately needed in hope discourse today. In the devotional writings, for example, we notice a substantive break with the snappy theodicy Luther offers in The Bondage of the Will. Here at last we discover words of comfort which could be spoken in the face of our 21st century mosaic of human pain. He writes, whatever the Christian sincerely prays for, especially in the unexpressed yearning of his heart, becomes a great unbearable cry in God's ears. God must listen, as he did to Moses in Exodus 14. Why do you cry to me? Even though Moses couldn't even whisper, so great was his anxiety and trembling in the terrible troubles that beset him. His sighs and the deep cry of his heart divided the Red Sea and dried it up, led the children of Israel across, and drowned Pharaoh with all his army. This and even more can be accomplished by a true spiritual longing. End quote. Here, Luther reinterprets hope as not eschatological postponement of justice, but instead as something found in our very own heartache, tears, sighs, and groans too deep for words. These signify a counterintuitive yet implicit hope for Luther that God is immanent and listening and will at last truly act as God. Luther introduces us to the idea of what we might call apophatic hope. He actually states that sometimes just to know what you do not hope for in some situations is enough. Maybe sometimes the best we can do, in other words, is to hope for hope. Not only God resides sub contrario, but hope too, hiding as it does under its seeming opposites, despair and lament. Perhaps this is what Luther means when he relates, it is in sorrow, when we are closest to despair, that hope rises the highest. Vastly empowering words, Luther implies in the above passage on Moses that our hope changes God, even when our hope is inchoate, as formless as a tear sliding down a child's cheek. Our hope also changes ourselves. Writes Luther, it happens that the thing hoped for and the person hoping become one through the tenseness of the hoping. As Blessed Augustine says, the soul is more where it loves than where it lives. By implication, if we hope for justice, peace, and human flourishing, we become one with these longings, and we strive without ceasing to realize these ideals in the world. For Luther, hope is contra-rational. It is hope against hope, excruciating in its incongruity with the present reality. Christian hope is not, quote, according to what can reasonably be expected to happen. We believe that God is favorably disposed to us even when we seem to ourselves to be forsaken, end quote. Here again, Luther takes seriously the grotesque reality and givenness of human suffering. Without the promises of God, he suggests, who could possibly look at this world and expect redemption? We can learn much then from Luther the person and pastoral theologian in juxtaposition with Luther the academic theologian. If Luther the man truly did believe in his own bondage of the will theodicy, how can we explain his Anfechtung? Doesn't Luther find the phrase, the righteousness of God, the most disturbing of all scriptural phrases because God's hiddenness in the world screams into our ears with a deafening, soul-piercing silence? Yet aren't the Anfechtungen the very place in Luther where contemporary Lutherans paradoxically find comfort, because none of us who allow human suffering to move us are a stranger to them. Christians in the 21st century, when speaking of hope and redemption, must avoid the trap of negatio negationis, to use Meister Eckhart's term. Redemption is always more than just negating the negativity, sweeping the ashes of human corpses under heaven's plush carpets. The problem with Christian hope is that in the 21st century, it has all too often become glib and platitudinous in just this way. This is particularly true in the mouths of the privileged, who fail to recognize that our own privilege and empowerment are the real sources of our hope, rather than God. This is my 21st century interpretation of Luther's comment, "One who has not yet lost hope in mammon and all the world and himself cannot hope in God." I wonder, is hope a word that has contrary meanings depending on who is saying it? Does the assertion, "I hope," mean the same if uttered by a Sudanese refugee, by Bill Gates, by Benazir Bhutto, by a diabetic child denied health care in the US, by Ahmadinejad, or by George Bush? What is to be done with disingenuous hope? What is our world in the 21st century if not often portrayed as a battlefield of hopes, yours against mine, ours against theirs, my nations against theirs? Luther helps me to unmask the aching ambiguity of our hopes when he observes, "We are never worse than when we appeared the best." Our first step to take, then, is to recognize the narcissism, ambiguity, and fear origin of many of our hopes, and to engage in prophetic critique vis-a-vis such hope. Reading Luther has helped me to understand that hope's opposite is not despair or doubt, as we might think. It is, of course, fear, the quintessential mood of the 21st century. What the world needs more of are people whose hope is not narcissistic, grounded in fear, coram me ipso, but instead relational and universal, grounded in God, coram Deo, aimed at the objective life fulfillment and flourishing of all. In an age of the demonization of alterity, Christians must summon the world to such impossibly capacious hope. Christian hope, grounded in love and relational lament, has jettisoned the fears of scarcity and security, as well as the fear of failure and the label idealistic. For Luther, God is the ultimate source of hope, and only God, similarly, should be feared. For the future, we 21st century Christians hope both with and paradoxically using Luther against Luther. Against Luther. We recognize the slippery ease with which hope can become perversion and speciousness, as evidenced when Luther's frustrated hope that Jews would all convert to Christianity evolved into staunch anti-Judaism and even anti-Semitism. With Luther, we hope and pray for spiritual discernment to help us distinguish in socio-political realms between a genuine hope for God's justice and mercy and disingenuous expressions of hope for God's justice, which merely veil ideology, materialism, and rapacious power-mongering. We hope to incarnate a hope which at long last rejects double standards, the sure hallmark of ideology, donning hope's veil in order to secure a naive bridegroom. Whatever hope is, it begins in grief, blood, and terror, and in the same breath denounces these very things. Every day we are surrounded with events which evoke hope. Already moments, such as a baby's laugh, the green sprout of the spring's first daffodil, the mother with Alzheimer's who remembers a daughter's name. But, taking our lead from the theology of the cross, our word of hope must also acknowledge at the same time the not yet. For what preceded all of these, if not a baby's tears, winter, forgetting, and disease? Because of Luther, we know to call things by their right names, even when this means the absence of God where the face of God should be. Reading Luther reveals that if inauthenticity pervades our Christian discourse about human suffering, inauthenticity likewise will taint our hope discourse regarding redemption and resurrection. 21st century Christian hope reclaims lament as its twin sister and gives her twin room enough to breathe in the crib where they lay side by side, both wakeful until the dawn. Whenever contemporary Christians speak of the light of grace, therefore, they must also speak of the light of Darfur, abject poverty, Auschwitz, and Hiroshima. The 21st century Christian word of hope takes suffering and injustice as seriously as it takes redemption. Emulating Luther's simul justus et peccator, it expresses the truth about human experience I term simul calamitas et redemptio. Luther gives us the theological resources to not eschew paradox, but instead to confront with a necessary theological honesty the lived tension induced by hope's contra-rationality. There is much silence, tears, and groans within our hope, because the 21st century Christian word of hope is an interrupted discourse. This is so because it listens as much to the global hopes of others as it speaks in its own voice. This hope is vigilant, with one ear to the ground listening for narratives of injustice, and the other ear to the wind, listening for narratives of grace and divine mercy. Hope resists horror and insists on a vision of the already, without which we perish. It is my hope that 21st century Christians will speak and live in such a way that hope will not remain a mere dream with a sequel, but instead will transform into a mode of being in the world with summer consequences for ourselves and others. Thank you.